So good evening, everyone. As Mary just explained, I recently completed a part-time master's in building history, and I researched the single-storey cowhouses in Castle Bolton for my dissertation. I came across this under-researched topic when I was working at the Yorkshire National Park Authority as their historic environment apprentice, and that was my job before my current role with the Western Dales Landscape Partnership Scheme. So the Yorkshire Dales are well known for their farm buildings and their field houses in particular. A particular type of field house is the single-storey cowhouse, and this type required further research. And as part of my research into these buildings, I explored the context of the village as both a farming and mining landscape, where the practice of small holdings and dual or multi-occupations could be found. For this presentation, I will give an introduction into some of my findings. And my screen's not moving for some reason. There we go. So in case you are unfamiliar with the area, this map shows where Castle Bolton is located. Historically, it was in the North Riding, what is now North Yorkshire. It is located within the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and this is split into a number of dales, and Castle Bolton can be found in Lower Wensleydale. This dale roughly straddles the A684, running east to west. So the village itself consists of a single street, with the houses situated on both sides of a green. Members of the Scrope family obtained the right to build Bolton Castle, a fortified home, in the late 14th century, and it was carefully sited to dominate the surrounding area. It was superseded as the family seat by Bolton Hall, a few kilometres to the southeast, which was first built in 1678. The family had one of the most extensive estates in the Dales, situated in Lower Wensleydale, and totaling around 15,000 acres. Each dale has its own specific character, in part developing from glacial action, giving each its final shape. In Wensleydale's case, broad and relatively shallow. Wensleydale is characterised by the Yoredale series of rocks, which consists of deposits of limestone, shale and sandstone. Erosion of the limestone has created distinctive step-like terraces along the valley. The village of Castle Bolton is situated on the hillside on one of these terraces. As a result of the surrounding geology, extractive industries developed alongside pastoral farming in this upland landscape. There is a long history of mining in the Yorkshire Dales. It started before the Romans came and continued until the end of the 19th century, with only some small pockets after this. In the Dales, the lead industry reached its height in the mid-19th century. At the time, nearly half the male workforce would have worked in lead mining. Although lead mining was an important industry in Wensleydale, even in its most prosperous periods, it is claimed that a greater value of butter, cheese and bacon were exported. The Bolton estate had some of the richest mines to be found in the Dale, owning many lead mines, a colliery and several flat quarries. As a result, the estate produced thousands of tons of ore, made huge profits and gave lucrative employment to many men for several generations. And at its peak, it provided work for about 20% of the total workforce. However, by the end of the 19th century, the lead industry was in irreversible decline due to demand being met by cheaper sources abroad. In Castle Bolton, the effects were seen, as you can see by the table on your screen. However, it did not lead to the same levels of emigration as other areas that were more reliant on mining for employment. This is in part linked to the multiple occupations and the carrying out of subsistence strategies like small holdings. Many occupations in rural upland areas could not be sustained full-time, which resulted in the undertaking of additional employment. These additions provided another source of income that enabled some families to subsist and afforded others a welcome supplement to an already adequate standard of living. It was a fragile system, but it could be an important buffer against poverty. The association of mining with small holdings is likely to have come from the dominance of miners in areas that have small holdings. However, these holdings were not exclusive to miners. In the census data for Castle Bolton, there were only 2 examples of a farmer and lead miner listed, of 17 examples of dual occupations. There was a greater diversity in employment opportunity in Lower Wensleydale, with a mix of agriculture, extractive industries, as well as crafts and other industries. Despite this, and due to the nature of the census data, many small holdings of miners were hidden. There is evidence that some lead miners were retiring to their small holdings. Their land had not been mentioned in any previous census, but it can be assumed that they already had the land. Lead miners often suffer from short life expectancies, and those that did live longer, their health had been ruined by respiratory disease, which would have meant they would no longer be able to mine, making the small holdings really essential parts of this multi-economy system. As I have mentioned, evidence for dual occupations is often underrepresented. Tables now showing on your screen show the role women played with regards to small holdings and farming more generally. The one on the right shows that were being left the holdings following the death of their husbands, and previously they weren't listed as having any occupation. The women were an important part of the dairy farming in the Dales, making butter and cheese, but also dealing with the vegetable and crop harvests, and it can also be assumed that children would have also had the jobs relating to the holding as well. And these are often hidden figures in documentary research, and it's not helped when the economy and the system that they were involved in is very hidden as well. So small holdings were an important part of this dual economy system. Small holdings varied considerably. However, some common features can be identified. Meadow and or pasture land, a garden for growing vegetables, and some livestock. It was thought that each cottage should at least have a small garden to contribute to the comfort and health of the family, as well as having the additional advantage of employing the man in the evenings, when his time might otherwise be diverted to a less useful purpose, otherwise known as the pub. Even a small amount of land could make a substantial difference to the comfort of families at this time, especially as the garths also enabled hens and a pig to be kept, which would also supplement the family's diet. It has been suggested that the miner's cottage was architecturally a farmstead, with a barn, hayloft, and living quarters all under one roof. This may have been the case in areas where miners mainly occupied isolated dwellings, but not in villages or hamlets. In Castle Bolton, most cottages had a number of smaller outbuildings to the rear, but they could not be equated to a farmstead. An example of a Castle Bolton homestead can be seen on your screen. This example marks a house, pigsty, privy, and ashes. However, the buildings at the homestead could not accommodate cattle, one of the most important aspects of the small holding and the focus of the rest of this presentation. So the produce of a cow was very important to their daily diet, as well as providing a meagre income if there was surplus, in the form of butter and cheese. Historically, access to milk was extremely limited if you did not have a supply of your own. In fact, labourers in the country were often worse supplied with milk than their counterparts in town, as in general, farmers did not sell their milk as sort of pure product. They transferred them into milk, butter and cheese. So in 1799, Castle Bolton had 50 families. 35 have one or more cows. Their families are therefore supplied with milk all or the greater part of the year. In contrast, of the 15 families who did not own a single cow, 8 were paupers. A century later, a land agent to the estate commented that a farthing's worth of new milk cannot be purchased either in this or many other townships at any time of the year. Smallholders only had small amounts of cattle. In Lower Wensleydale, the average dairy herd was 3 cattle in 1874. This meant they were very important, evidenced by the land agent's comment in 1805 that if the cows of the small farmers were distrained and sold, it would be their ruin and cause them to quit the country. This led to the creation of insurance schemes to cover the cost of replacement in case of accident or disease. No evidence survives that this took place in Castle Bolton, but it did occur in other parishes on the estate. In the winter, roughly October to May, the cattle were usually housed in cowhouses or fieldhouses, but in the summer, they were on pasture land. The provision of facilities to enable the smallholder to keep cattle was important. There was consistent demand for small amounts of land as well as gates for their cattle. Gates refer to the amount of animals that were allowed to graze on a stinted pasture. A stinted pasture was a large area of unenclosed land that had a limit to the amount of livestock kept on it. It is clear from the table on your screen that the majority of gates belong to holdings below 10 acres. In 1797, the 106 gates were split over 4 areas of township that totalled about 355 acres. This pasture would have been used over the summer months for a large proportion of the cattle in the parish, but not all, as farmers and some smallholders also held pasture fields which they could use. As I mentioned previously, Yorkshire Dales is well known for its abundance of traditional farm buildings, having over 6,000 in total. The heat map currently on your screen shows the concentration of fieldhouses in Wensleydale, as they were shown on the second edition 25-inch arrest map. In this context, fieldhouses refer to any traditional farm building located in a field away from a farmstead or outbarn. On the right-hand side of your screen, indicated with an arrow, is Castle Bolton, and the concentration of fieldhouses is evident by the red blob. When you think of field barns in the Yorkshire Dales, this is probably what you imagine. These 2-storey field barns are for the overwintering of cattle and for the storage of crops. They function as part of an annual cycle with the surrounding field. Over winter, cows are housed in the barn. They produce muck, which is then spread over the surrounding field. This fertilises the field and produces the hay crop. This is fed to the cows and the cycle repeats. However, there are not many examples of this type of field house in Castle Bolton. Instead, single-storey cow houses are the dominant type. Essentially, it is a byre. There is no loft and there is no space for hay storage. Instead, they only house cattle. This screen shows a typical interior, and this example would have only housed 2 cattle. The majority of cow houses in Castle Bolton house fewer than 4 cattle, with only a couple attached to the larger farms able to house more. At this point, I just want to mention that it is not the prevalence of small holdings which has led to this form of a cow house with no storage space, as small holdings were a prolific practice through parts of the Dale, and many of these areas have the more usual 2-storey field barn form. So as vernacular buildings, cow houses were built with local materials. This minimised the heavy expense of transport. They were predominantly constructed from roughly coarse sandstone, however a number of them contain some limestone as well, the stone coming from quarries on the estate. They were built from 2 faces of stone with a rubble core bound together by 3 stones. However, these do not project externally, as is commonly the case with lofted field barns in the Dales. 89% of the cow houses still have a roof. Of these, the majority have sandstone flags as their roofing material. In a small number of cases, Welsh slate was used. This could be quickly and easily imported after the arrival of the railway in the 1870s. Although there is pictorial evidence of thatch in the village of Castle Bolton, on the cottages and the houses, until about 1900, there is no evidence of former roof lines at a steeper pitch on the single-storey cow houses, which suggests they never had thatch roofs. All of the cow houses are sited along current or former field boundaries, and barns that were situated in the corners of or between meadows minimise the transport of both hay and manure. When I first surveyed these buildings, I found a small number of surviving cow houses with a slightly different character, which I thought might represent earlier examples of cow houses. These buildings have more elaborately formed openings, with coin surrounds, unlike the rest of the buildings that usually just have a thin stone lintel. And in the Yorkshire Dales, this typically represents an 18th century date. These buildings have also undergone more major alterations, including changes to their plan forms with the insertion of secondary doorways. However, map evidence suggests they were built between 1799 and 1854, and as such don't appear to be some of the earliest barns in the parish. However, it is still possible that these cow houses could be survivals of an earlier building form, as it is feasible that the 8 building sites in 1799 that still have cow houses have been rebuilt. There was a national trend from the beginning of the 19th century to build single-storey cow houses without a loft. The use of lofts had been deplored by agricultural theorists, who instead recommended airy cowhouses that were both better lit and ventilated than what had been built previously. Not only did the lofts inhibit ventilation, but it was also noted that there was a danger of dust from the fodder falling onto the animals beneath, and of the air from the cowhouse flavouring whatever was stored above. In stables, the lofts provided warmth for the horses when they returned after a day's work. In comparison, cattle spent the whole winter in the cowhouse, and as such kept it permanently warm, making the loft unnecessary. This realisation only increased the need for ventilation, as too much warmth produced a risk of disease. Some of these cowhouses were built before this national trend, and it is unlikely that these were the reasons why they had no loft. But it is interesting to understand the national picture of cowhouses and what this form means on that more national picture. William's study of cowhouses in North East Wales has suggested the single-storey form was due to the estate saving money and not seeing the need to provide shelter space for crops. So standard lofted field barns have no or very little ventilation directly for the buyer, though doors which were rarely close-fitting would have provided some. In these cases of lofted field barns, the ventilation tends to be where the hay was stored. In contrast, the cowhouses in Castle Bolton are fairly well ventilated buildings. The majority have ventilation slits in one or more commonly two gables. The second most common type of ventilation is the use of ventilation pipes under the eaves, and occasionally a number of smaller pipes are used within the ventilation slit. And there was a tile works in Redmire, a neighbouring village, which was possibly the source of these pipes. In addition, rows of ventilation holes under the eaves were found, and in some cases they were adjustable, as they have wooden shutters that could be opened and closed internally. In a small number of cowhouses, there were larger windows with adjustable sliding ventilators, otherwise known as hit and miss ventilators. This type of opening was introduced in the 19th century and appears to have been a later insertion in most examples. Their form, therefore, suggests that they were not the dank, dark, and ill-ventilated building that had been greatly criticised elsewhere. So I surveyed 44 field houses in Castle Bolton parish. 36 of these were single-storey cowhouses, and these are indicated by the triangles on the map you can see. The map also shows the concentration of buildings in the fields, mainly to the south of the village. There are no cowhouses to the west of the parish due to the location of 3 large farms on this side, and the southern part of the map is a different parish. So as I've said, the triangles signify the single-storey cowhouses. Any square represents that other field house type, whether that be a field barn or a cart house or even a sheep house in one example. The red crosses indicate pole barns, which are features that I'll be discussing later on in this talk. And the circle on your key doesn't apply to this map. Unfortunately, no map showing field houses survived for Castle Bolton before 1799. This estate map shows 43 field houses. However, the practice of overwintering cattle dated from before this. The map on your screen has been plotted with data from the 1799 estate map. I don't know whether you can see my mouse. Obviously, there's more of a concentration of field houses, potentially cow houses, in this area of the parish, compared to the surviving cow houses today, the ones you saw on the slide before. So a previous estate map dating from 1778 did not show any buildings. I personally don't think this was because there weren't any, but instead that the map was not surveying buildings in fields, because that's not what it was for. Both this and the 1799 estate map have numbers in the fields that should relate to the estate's field books, which mainly date to the 18th century. And therefore it should have been possible to link the fields and therefore the barns with individual smallholders and farmers. However, due to several changes in numbering systems, it was not possible during my research to do this. The buildings themselves have few datable features, so they are difficult as a reliable dating tool. Further research into this field house type, as well as field houses more generally, might provide further understanding as to the origin date of these buildings. It is clear, however, that there is a long tradition of this form. In the Yorkshire Dales, early surviving field barns from the 17th century suggest that they were once thatched single-storey buildings with no internal hay storage. This type of building was largely swept away from the Dales, with many incorporated into larger barns, and these have evidence of raised eaves. Small single-storey cow houses with adjoining hay barns are located in Hurst, Arkengarth Dale. This dale is located to the north of Wensleydale. They have been described as being similar to those found in Castle Bolton, but are believed to be older and more primitive. Many of these have now been demolished, but those that survive show that they were thatched with ling. As I have previously stated, there is no evidence that the cow houses in Castle Bolton were previously thatched, nor is there any evidence that they originated as crook structures or contain any reused crooks. This suggests that they have later origins than this earlier type of building in the Dales, but may have been influenced by them. The Bolton estate held large amounts of Lower Wensleydale, including Castle Bolton. The first table on the screen shows that they held 98% of land, with the remaining 2% being glebe land. The neighbouring parishes are also included on the tables on your screen. Although the material in the Record Office relating to the estate did not include much, if any, material on the cow houses themselves, there is a high probability that these buildings were built and maintained by the estate. This would explain the high concentrations not only in Castle Bolton, but also in surrounding villages connected to it. These tables suggest a correlation between the proportion owned by the estate and the percentage of cow houses in each parish. However, this needs further research to confirm. There are a number of cash books within the archive. However, they have very limited details, so the payments cannot be related to individual buildings, and they only survive from 1845 to 1920. Despite these limitations, they do show continual payment on cottages' cow houses. For instance, the estate spent £132, 5 shillings and 4 pence on cow houses between 1894 and 1895. It is therefore clear that the estate was at times spending a substantial amount of money on the upkeep and or building of these cow houses. The single-storey cow house could appear to be quite a simple traditional farm building. However, although they were only used to house cattle in winter, there are a number of different types and variants of plan forms. The different types relate to whether the cattle face the gable or long wall, and whether a fodder gang is included in the plan. The variants are based on the number of doors, which influences how the barn is used. This typology that you can see is based on 30 cow houses in Castle Bolton, in which the layout could be determined. In some cases, this has been done by using fragments of surviving evidence. The remaining 6 could not be determined due to their ruined state or lack of access. Type B2 is the most common, and the examples house between 2 to 4 cattle. This layout is the most labour and time efficient, having 2 doors, one leading to the fodder gang and the other the byre. The fodder gang allowed easier access to feed the cattle. And it has been said that the most advanced of the cow sheds had a feeding passage and each had a manger for dry meat. And I will be talking about feed troughs a little later on. On your screen, there is an example of a type B2, which could have housed 4 cattle. An outshot has been added at a later date to the west, allowing an additional 2 cattle to be housed. There is evidence within the varying typologies that these cow houses have received alterations over time. For instance, there are no surviving unaltered examples of type B1, which had just 1 door leading into the byre. However, it was clear that 2 of the cow houses originally had this layout. A door allowing entry into the fodder gang had been inserted at a later point, probably when the pole barn was added, making them type B2 and more efficient. Another example of change is that about 1/5 of cow houses in Castle Bolton have undergone alterations to follow government guidelines from the mid-20th century. This does not suggest that most of these buildings had fallen out of use by this time, as many byres in the Yorkshire Dales were never altered. The layout of the cow house on your screen, now type C2, has been altered in line with regulations, but the changes also enabled it to house a greater number of cattle, 5 instead of 3. Evidence of a keep hole located near the southeast corner suggests that its original layout conformed to type B2, with the cattle facing the gable rather than the long wall. Two doors are also no longer necessary for the current layout. The door in the north gable wall relates to a concrete platform for a pole barn. This door would have presumably linked with a fodder gang, as is typical with the other surviving cowhouses in the parish. In type C and D, the castle faced a long wall, but in comparison to the type C2 on the previous slide, type D has a fodder gang. In the example on your screen, this relates to the pole barn on the north side. This example houses 6 cattle, and often this orientation of cattle enabled more to be housed. In addition to the different types of cowhouses, there are also several examples of paired cowhouses, where 2 cowhouses are positioned side by side with a shared wall. These have often been the most altered. There are 6 examples that show evidence of being paired cowhouses in Castle Bolton. 4 of these have evidence that suggests that one cowhouse was built first and another was added later. Originally, these paired cowhouses were located in 2 different fields. At least 3 of these examples have had an internal door inserted. This alteration likely occurred when the holdings were amalgamated. Tuke was not impressed with the lack of attention or judgment applied to the making and preserving of manure that was produced on the farms in the North Riding of Yorkshire. However, outside about a third of cowhouses, there is a small walled structure that reportedly enclosed the muck heap. This would have given some protection to the Midden before it was spread over the surrounding fields. However, it does appear to require more work than simply piling a muck heap next to whichever opening was used to shovel it out. The understanding of this use is linked to a discussion with a local farmer, but there is no independent evidence that this was in fact what it was used for. One alternative but unproven theory is that they were originally used to protect the haystack. It would be useful to know if anyone has come across these features anywhere else, and if you're aware of any alternate purposes. I have previously stated the main difference for these buildings is the lack of hay storage. You may have been wondering where this crop was kept, if not in the Fieldhouse, and I will address this now. So there are 18 surviving pole barns in Castle Bolton. An example can be seen in the top right-hand corner. They appear on maps that were surveyed in 1891, and it indicated because different materials are used, depicted with the different colours. So red depicts the stone cowhouse and black for the wooden iron pole barns. It is likely they date to the final quarter of the 19th century, when the railway was able to import non-local materials more easily. Before this, haystacks would have been used. There's evidence of haystacks being used in the Dales well into the 19th century. However, they are under-researched and their continued use is probably not fully understood. In countries where traditional forms of farming continue, they still use haystacks. These do not leave any archaeological remains and may be similar to what would have been found in the Dales. An example can be seen in the bottom left. There are 2 main types of construction of pole barns. Over half have a stone wall as one of the elevations, and the rest are constructed solely from poles and corrugated sheeting. Iron columns have been used for one of the surviving pole barns, and another has an entirely iron frame. There were also 2 surviving examples that are located in fields on their own, unrelated to any cowhouse. Others of this type no longer survive. A local resident recalls these buildings being constructed or moved from different locations in the second half of the 20th century. It is also worth noting that cattle were often given a mixed diet. It was thought that the cost of winter keep could be substantially reduced by feeding a fodder crop which had a high yield per acre compared to hay that was made from grass. As a result, turnips became commonplace as part of the winter fodder crop for cattle. Evidence in Castle Bolton suggests that cattle would have been fed a mixed diet. The agricultural statistics show that a small amount of land was used to grow fodder crops like turnips, and the Wensleydale Railway line, built in the 1870s, allowed the import of a variety of agricultural products, including corn and feed cake. This mixed diet is corroborated by the built heritage, as all the cowhouses with surviving internal fittings had evidence of a feed trough, suitable for chopped foods such as turnips and chaff, as well as hay racks. This mixed diet may have been one of the reasons why the cowhouses did not have any capacity to store hay, but it has also been suggested that Lower Wensleydale has less rainfall than some of the neighbouring dales, and this meant an alternative to haystacks was not needed. These cowhouses have recently fallen out of use, as they no longer suit modern farming methods. Despite this change from the second half of the 20th century, the practice of small holdings survived unusually long in Castle Bolton, and there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, the parish was never enclosed, which enabled the practice of small holdings to continue unchanged. Elsewhere, parliamentary enclosure heralded the decline of small holdings, as they could not support themselves without this common pasture, and they were often not able to enclose areas of land themselves. Secondly, it has often been suggested that small holdings ceased with the decline and eventual end of lead mining towards the end of the 19th century. Miners either stayed in the area as farmers, with small holdings amalgamated to make farms, or they abandoned them and migrated to other industrial areas in the north of England, or emigrated to America. However, the system in Castle Bolton was more complex, and data from a number of sources show that it did not disappear overnight. This is in part due to the mixed economy of Lower Wensleydale and the variety of occupations they were employed in. Therefore, although there was a decline, it was not as marked as some of the other areas. In Lower Wensleydale generally, small holdings of 1 to 5 acres remained in significant numbers up to 1915. And in Castle Bolton, the 1910 Finance Act shows that there were 15 holdings under 10 acres, and by the early 1940s, there were still at least 5 of that size, 4 of which had 5 cows or less. When we think about the future of these buildings, it is often said that a useless building is an obstacle to good farming and a drain on the farmer's resource. And this is true. However, it would be a loss for these buildings and the farming system they represent to disappear altogether. This is especially the case with the single-storey cowhouse in Castle Bolton, which are a special collection of these atypical buildings in the Yorkshire Dales. The future of these buildings is perhaps bleak, and one reason why it's been so crucial for this study to be undertaken. Their small size means they are not suitable for many forms of adaptation, nor for alternative uses. Only a couple of cowhouses have been adapted to a new use. One in the grounds of the castle has become a bee house, another cowhouse has become a studio, and another has become a garage. Only one that I surveyed still had cattle in, however the interior fittings had all been removed. The title of this talk suggested that Castle Bolton was a farm and miner landscape. However, I hope it is clear that the landscape was much more complex than this. And I hope you would also agree that these buildings are an interesting field house type, which has received very little attention previously and would certainly benefit from further research in the future, both in other areas of the Dales, as well as putting it in a more national context. Thank you very much for listening.